That's the last of the protostome phyla that we're going to cover. And I now want to turn our attention over to this little branch of the tree of life over here, the deuterostome animals. Again, what they share in common are some very deep developmental traits that are not shared with all of these. But the other phyla that are in the deuterostomes with us, we're in the phylum Chordata, the other deuterostome phyla really don't look anything like us at all. So here are the deuterostomes. We're going to look at two different phyla within that group, the Echinodermata and the Chordata. The Echinodermata, I mean, really insects and some mollusks strike us as being more like us than most echinoderms do. And this is because echinoderms typically have a really radically different body form than what we are used to when we think of animals. There are about 6,000 species in the Echinodermata, and they have these very evocative names: sea stars, brittle stars, sea urchins, sea cucumbers. Basically, these are names that describe more or less what they look like, or in the case of brittle stars, how easy it is to accidentally break one. What makes them seem so alien to us is that they don't have bilateral symmetry. They have pentaradial symmetry, which means that there are 5 different planes of symmetry through which you can divide them and get essentially mirror image halves. Okay, this is basically a variation on radial symmetry, and it strikes us as very odd because essentially you end up with an animal that has no head. These animals are not cephalized, and so we have trouble relating to them. They have a lot of other traits that are also very, very strange. One of the peculiar things is the system called the water vascular system in the echinoderm body. It's used for respiration, that is gas exchange. It's also used to get rid of waste, but it's also used for moving around and eating things. What it is a series of tubes that runs all through the animal's body, and it opens to the outside. There's this little plate with lots of pores in it on the outside of the animal, and seawater can pass into that tube. From there, it passes through the animal's body. It can go down these tubes that go into the arms, for example, of a sea star like this one. And from those arms, the water actually goes into these little turkey baster-like structures on either side. These are basically these little hydraulic systems that run the tube feet of a echinoderm. And this is how most echinoderms get around, is by walking on these little hydraulic feet. What they can do is the water in this tube foot is incompressible, and so when the muscles around the top of this structure squeeze, it extends the tube foot out. Then little tiny muscles around it, the tube foot, move it around, and so the entire animal, this very big animal potentially, walks on hundreds and hundreds of these little legs. So the fluid in the water vascular system, it plays a lot of different roles in the life of an echinoderm. If you've ever tried to pick up one of these animals, with the exception of a lot of the brittle stars, you may find the tube feet are extremely sticky. That is because they make suction cups at the bottom that can be attached and detached at will. Some of these animals, like the sea stars, can hold on incredibly tightly, because what these animals do, how they make a living, is they take a hold of a shellfish, like say a mussel, and they attach themselves to both sides with their tube feet, and then they just pull for hours and hours and hours and hours until the shellfish just wears out. The muscles that it's using to close the shell just wear out, and it opens up and gets eaten. Here's a view of those tube feet. These are little suction cups at the bottom. Believe me, they can stick pretty tightly to something. I have had sea stars that I've been taking care of for zoology labs, and they are by far the most difficult of the animals to move when you want to put them in a different aquarium, because usually they stick to something and refuse to let go. Echinoderms have a skeleton. It's very different than any of the skeletons, actually, that we've seen before, because while it's mostly wrapped around the outside of the guts of the animal, it's still within a layer of living tissue. So the echinoderm skeleton typically is this set of plates made of calcium carbonate that are found just within the living tissue of the animal. So they are within the tissue, and therefore they are technically an endoskeleton, but functionally they act a lot like an exoskeleton, in that they protect the internal organs. A lot of the attachment points are on the inside of the skeleton rather than the outside. It's really pretty confusing. The these calcium carbonate structures can be extended outward to become these very long spines, like say what you see in sea urchins. Some sea stars also have these pretty sharp spines. The other thing that's interesting about the skeleton of the urchin is that the ossicles are all fused together just within the surface of its body so that they look like this. This is a very rugged, resistant case. It also is called a test, just like the protective case on the outside of some protists. The echinoderms actually have a couple of different circulatory systems. They use both the water vascular system, which you might remember as this tube running the length of the sea star's arm, and here, I'm sorry, I should have said, what you're looking at here is a cross section of a sea star's arm. There's a big hollow on the inside of this, which is the coelom. That's that ancestral cavity that forms when the mesoderm, basically within the mesoderm, it's formed within the mesoderm during very early development. It's filled with fluid in echinoderms, and a ciliary action moves that fluid around so that the animal can circulate substances or gases within its body. As I mentioned, these are not generally cephalized animals. They do not have what you would call a brain. At most, there's a nerve ring around the mouth and another one around the anus. However, these animals can be quite active. But the way that they achieve this high level of activity is really quite different than the way that we would do it. An echinoderm is essentially run by committee. A lot of the activity of the animal is sort of what each region does is sort of is basically farmed out to the nerves in that particular region. So different body segments are effectively acting independently of one another, at least as far as it comes to the fine movements. The entire animal sort of puts together a picture of where it wants to go, and of course there is some communication with the parts, so that half the body isn't trying to move this way and the other half isn't trying to move this way. But it's very strange from our point of view, because to a large extent, different parts of an echinoderm's body work independently of one another. This is very helpful in some circumstances because an echinoderm can lose different parts of its body and just grow them back. I've actually seen echinoderms in the wild where part of their body has died and the other half is doing just fine. Echinoderms are famous for being able to regrow stuff that gets damaged or missing. And you can see what's happening here with this sea star. It lost 3 of its arms, but it is okay. It's getting enough food to be able to grow them back. In some species, any chunk of the body can potentially regrow the whole body if you give it enough food. Don't try this at home. We tend to think of predators as fast-moving, cephalized animals. Sea stars actually are predators. The way that they get away with being predators, despite the fact they are extremely slow, is that they prey on things that don't move at all. They prey on sessile animals and most particularly on bivalves or shellfish. Here you can see a sea star doing its usual feeding thing. It's got a hold of this mussel shell from both sides, and it's just going to pull and pull and pull and pull and pull. until the muscle just becomes so exhausted that it can't hold its shell shut anymore. At that point, the shell opens just a little crack. That wouldn't seem very helpful to the sea star because the sea star can't fit the entire mussel, shell, and all into its mouth. But what it does is the next best thing. It basically vomits its own stomach out through its mouth and stuffs the stomach inside the mussel shell. Then the stomach lining secretes gastric juices. Those juices digest the mussel inside its own shell, and the sea star slurps up the whole disgusting lot. Brittle stars look a little bit like sea stars, and they have the 5 arms. But in the brittle stars, these arms, or what they're called technically are rays, are long and flexible. They can be used to crawl and they can be used to row through the water, propelling the animal along. Although the sea urchins are echinoderms, they really don't look like the sea stars or the brittle stars. They don't have the 5 arms. Oh, sorry, you don't need to know the name of the class. This is the name of the class in which sea urchins belong, but you can just ignore that. Sea urchins are grazers. They feed on plants or algae or particulate matter. They're most famous for looking like little purple pincushions. They do, in fact, have the same basic body form as a sea star or a brittle star. It's pentaradial symmetry. To get from the shape of a sea star to the shape of a sea urchin, all you have to do is something like this. You basically take the 5 arms and drape them down into a ball, and lo and behold, you've got something that's ball-shaped rather than sea star-shaped. It's when you look at the skeleton of a sea urchin that you see that it is, in fact, pentaradially symmetrical. Here are the 5 different double rows of tube feet. Each arm of a sea star has a row of tube feet running down a double row of tube feet, and these are basically the homologous structures on a sea urchin. The innovations of the sea urchin have all the ossicles fused together into this solid test, and then have the spines sticking out all over. These do, of course, function for the defense of the animal, but they can also be used like stilts to walk around on. The other group of echinoderms also doesn't look pentaradially symmetrical, but in this case it's because it isn't. These are the sea cucumbers, and they have evolved along really different lines than the rest of the echinoderms. For one thing, they basically have lost the calcareous endoskeleton. If you basically dissolve a sea cucumber and look under the microscope, you'll find these tiny, tiny little nuggets of calcium carbonate called ossicles, but they don't serve any skeletal purpose. If you imagine a sea urchin that kind of got stretched upward into a column and then it fell over and the tube feet drifted down toward the bottom side, you'd have essentially something like a sea cucumber. Sea cucumbers are more mobile than the other groups of the echinoderms. They have 3 rows of tube feet on the bottom. The other 2 rows of tube feet are now on the top, and they've pretty much withered away, so they're not functional. But they use these rows of tube feet on the bottom to trundle along the seafloor, and usually what they're busy doing is mopping up debris. So largely because they have evolved to move around and have a head end that goes first, echinoderms have evolved bilateral symmetry. It's worth noting that all the echinoderms come from bilaterally symmetrical ancestors. You can tell because all of the larvae of the different echinoderms are bilaterally symmetrical. So what has happened is that the echinoderms, very long ago, before the protostomes split away from the deuterostomes, they had some kind of radially symmetrical ancestor, and then they evolved to be bilaterally symmetrical, and then the echinoderms evolved to be pentaradially symmetrical, and then the sea cucumbers evolved to be bilaterally symmetrical all over again. It's like evolution cannot make up its mind. And this is one of these great examples of how evolution is not headed toward a particular goal or going anywhere with a particular plan. It's just kind of wandering around, doing the best it can. One final party trick of the sea cucumbers. Don't mess with one too much, or it will basically poop out its guts on you. Essentially, when they become too disturbed, the sea cucumber will squeeze a lot of its internal muscles so tightly that a lot of its guts will come shooting out of its anus. Often the guts are covered with toxic or sticky substances, and I guess the point of this is that to entangle a potential predator in this noxious material, or maybe just to freak them out so much that they leave. Again, not something you want to try at home.